It did not begin with gunfire, nor the thunder of marching crowds. It began with silence broken only by a voice on national radio. We don't need donations. We need you. No drums, no banners, no slogans, just a sentence that pierced deeper than 100 speeches. Within hours, echoes of those words reached hospital corridors in Canada, lecture halls in Germany, and offices in California. Across oceans, men and women set down their tools, looked at their families and whispered, "It is time." This was no coup, no campaign. It was a calling. And at its center stood a young soldier president, Ibrahim Traore, who did not ask for pity, did not beg for aid, but simply reminded his people of their worth. That reminder stirred not only Burkina Faso, but the spirit of a continent long told its best belonged elsewhere. Stay with us. This isn't just news. It is Africa daring to rewrite its own chapter. Subscribe and let your voice stand with ours, for dignity cannot rise alone. But if a single sentence could summon thousands home, what might happen when the world begins to listen? The moment passed almost unnoticed inside the recording booth of Ouagadougou's national radio. A technician leaned back in his chair, unaware that the phrase he had just aired would ripple across oceans within hours. Yet within 72 hours, the airports of Burkina Faso were no longer quiet gateways. They had become the epicenters of a movement history books could not have imagined. Flights bound for Ouagadougou were suddenly filled not with tourists or contractors, but with returnees, builders, healers, teachers, coders, Africans who had once scattered across the world in search of opportunity, now turning back not out of failure, but conviction. At Ouagadougou International, immigration officers abandoned protocol to help elderly women down the jet bridge. One soldier saluted a nurse from Oslo who still wore her hospital badge. A man in a gray coat clutched nothing but a cloth bag of soil from his village. Nearby, a girl held blueprints for a maternity ward she had dreamed of since childhood. The world outside had no name for what was happening. Was it migration? A political stunt? A glitch in the system? Inside the arrival halls, it felt like something else. Something that could not be packaged for headlines. In Bobo Dioulasso, families gathered to meet long-lost relatives stepping off buses from the capital. Streets filled with embraces, tears mingled with laughter. One teenage robotics engineer hugged an old woman in traditional dress. "You are finally home," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes wet, as if decades of absence had been lifted in a single moment. None of them had been promised land, money, or comfort. They came with laptops, medical textbooks, ultrasound machines wrapped in blankets, and coded hospital software scribbled on napkins. A returned agronomist carried nothing but his grandfather's rusted spade, a farmer handing it back with the words, "This will dig deeper in your hands than mine." Beyond the terminals, villages began stirring. In Kaya, Dr. Hale Lima placed her palm on the cracked wall of a crumbling clinic and declared simply, "We build here." Within days, truckloads of cement and timber arrived. No foreign logos, no NGO banners, just volunteers with conviction. Grandmothers brought bowls of ground nuts to feed workers, telling stories of birth traditions once mocked in textbooks. Young engineers patched hospital systems to run offline during blackouts. Teachers reopened classrooms using lesson plans that celebrated local heroes rather than distant emperors. Meanwhile, the government stood not above but beside the people. Housing documents were processed swiftly, land reallocated, foreign qualifications recognized overnight. But this was no top-down policy. It was bottom-up rebirth. The pulse of the return spread by mouth, by signal, by memory. At the old telecommunications building, 5 young men unpacked servers and solar routers, determined to build a national firewall that would no longer depend on foreign networks. They worked through the night, sleeping in shifts beneath flickering bulbs. Across town, Cora, the designer once hailed as the Milan miracle, painted a warehouse yellow, transforming it into a design school for barefoot girls. In a village outside Fada, teenagers painted murals of returning heroes alongside ancestral kings, bridging past and present in color and clay. It was not charity, it was reclamation. The diaspora, once dismissed as spectators, had become the hand on the shovel, the eye behind the microscope, the fingerprint in the national code. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for outside permission. It was moving with its own rhythm. In the evenings, bonfires lit construction sites as elders told stories of rivers and lineages to young coders, sketching new systems by torchlight. At the National Radio Building, musicians blended ancestral rhythms with modern beats, recording songs of resistance. One lyric captured the spirit best. "We came not for gold, but for the soil beneath it." By the end of the first week, the scale was undeniable. Return flights were fully booked for weeks. Applications for what locals now called Mission Renaissance exceeded 25,000. Ministries scrambled not to lead but to keep up. Yet on the ground, the heartbeat remained uncoordinated, authentic, unstoppable. This was no campaign, no propaganda. It was the quiet rise of dignity, a return not only of bodies but of memory. And as the dust of the first arrivals settled, a question larger than any single airport began to take shape. If 72 hours could rewrite the direction of a nation, what storm might follow when an entire continent begins to move? By the second week, what began as a whisper had turned into a roar no microphone could capture. The streets of Burkina Faso pulsed with a strange mixture of disbelief and inevitability. Clinics once abandoned lit up through the night as returning doctors scrubbed walls and unpacked solar-powered incubators. Schoolyards, long silenced, rang with children reciting lessons about their own ancestors rather than distant conquerors. Roads once left half-built by foreign contractors were now being paved by young men who had studied engineering in London, Toronto, and Berlin, choosing sweat and soil over salaries abroad. The emotional climax came in Kaya, where villagers gathered to watch Dr. Hale Lima reopen the doors of a crumbling maternity ward. She placed her hand on the cracked plaster, tears forming as she whispered, "We build here." Behind her stood midwives from Toronto, trauma nurses from Oslo, and young volunteers from Paris, all nodding silently. When the first cry of a newborn echoed through those halls days later, mothers wept openly in the courtyard, whispering blessings for the children who had chosen to come back. Everywhere, returnees carried not riches, but conviction. In Ouagadougou, 5 young developers spent sleepless nights coding a firewall to protect national data from foreign dependence. A teenage robotics engineer led workshops beneath a leaking roof, teaching local students to assemble low-cost prosthetics from scrap metal. In Bobo Dioulasso, designer Cora stitched proverbs into uniforms for girls who had once believed beauty belonged only on foreign runways. And the people responded. Farmers handed over tools passed down for generations, saying, "Your hands will dig deeper than ours." Grandmothers arrived at construction sites with bowls of groundnuts, their stories feeding more than hunger. Elders gathered around bonfires to tell tales of rivers and kingdoms, while young coders scribbled algorithms by torchlight. The old and the new met, not in conflict, but in harmony, an intergenerational pact of resilience. The atmosphere was electric, but it was also fragile. Local radio stations played testimonies of returnees late into the night. One nurse cried on air as she recalled delivering a baby with her bare hands in Burkina Faso, though she had once worked in a hospital with 10 incubators in Oslo. Her voice broke. "This is why I came back." Villagers who had gathered around crackling radios sobbed quietly, pride swelling in their chests. Yet outside, the narrative twisted. In Brussels, a private policy briefing labeled the return movement unmanageable, destabilizing. In Paris, a television panel argued heatedly over whether Africa should be allowed to reabsorb its talent. In Washington, a leaked cable warned of a reverse brain drain threatening critical healthcare capacity in 5 American cities. The clash between perception and reality sharpened. While villagers dug irrigation trenches by hand, international analysts debated terms like talent reabsorption and migration threat index. To the people on the ground, these words meant little. What mattered were classrooms that no longer sat empty, clinics that no longer stood silent, and fields that now greened with ancestral seeds. President Ibrahim Traore remained measured amid the crescendo. When foreign diplomats warned of global labor imbalances, he replied calmly, "You had them for 30 years. Let us have them for 1 generation." His words did not thunder, but they shook. A foreign affairs analyst later wrote, "It wasn't defiance, it was redefinition." This steady tone contrasted sharply with the euphoria sweeping the streets. Markets renamed stalls after returning doctors and teachers. Billboards once plastered with telecom ads now bore the faces of returnees in lab coats and construction helmets. On one mural, a young girl stood beneath the words, "I don't dream of leaving anymore." Still, doubts lingered. Could this surge of passion endure? Could infrastructure built by conviction withstand the weight of bureaucracy, scarcity, and foreign pressure? The people did not ask these questions aloud. They were too busy building, too busy believing. And as the world debated, a deeper current began to stir. Other African nations, Ghana, Benin, Kenya, watched closely, their own diaspora beginning to whisper of return. The spark in Ouagadougou was no longer confined to its borders. It was spreading, unseen but unstoppable. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could carry the movement forward. The question was whether the continent was ready to follow. The first visible changes were not in government reports or international headlines, but in the rhythm of daily life. In villages that had long relied on aid deliveries, clinics reopened with medicines produced by local labs, staffed by returnee chemists. Mothers no longer had to walk for hours to reach a maternity ward. Children carried school books donated not by foreign agencies, but by engineers who had printed them locally, embedding the stories of Thomas Sankara and national heroes alongside arithmetic and science. Markets, once flooded with imported goods, began to carry produce cultivated through new irrigation systems, designed by agronomists who had returned from Amsterdam and Nairobi. Farmers saw their yields increase by 40% within a single season. For the first time in years, traders spoke of surplus rather than shortage. The slogan "Return and Rebuild" appeared chalked on blackboards in classrooms, painted on stalls in markets, whispered in conversations across courtyards. On the political stage, the transformation was equally stark. Ministries that had once relied on foreign consultants now found themselves surrounded by professionals who had chosen to bring their expertise home. The Ministry of Health scrapped donor-dependent strategies and launched a diaspora health fund channeled directly into rural clinics. The Ministry of Education convened its first council of returnee teachers to redesign the curriculum. No longer would French literature dominate the syllabus. Now students read Chinua Achebe and Mariama Ba alongside Victor Hugo. Even the courts began to change. Judges who had once studied in London or Paris returned to serve in local benches. Legal aid desks opened in community halls, staffed by lawyers determined to make justice accessible in 3 languages. During one televised hearing, a judge declared, "Justice must sound like the people it claims to serve." The statement resonated across the nation. In Burkina Faso, governance itself was shifting. Town halls were no longer held in offices, but beneath mango trees, where farmers, builders, and school teachers debated infrastructure plans with local officials. Community cooperatives gained legal recognition. Return advisory boards were added to regional planning committees. What had once been a top-down bureaucracy began to take the shape of participatory governance. Economic life followed suit. A group of returnees launched a logistics union that replaced a European contractor within weeks, cutting costs and boosting farmers' profits. New roads connected remote villages to urban markets. Trade laws were amended to prioritize intra-African supply chains, reducing dependence on European imports. Billboards across Ouagadougou no longer advertised foreign telecom companies, but instead showcased the faces of local doctors, engineers, and teachers who had returned. One poster bore the words, "I no longer dream of leaving." The cultural climate was equally profound. National theaters staged plays in Moray and Dioula, funded not by Paris but by collectives of returnee artists. Local cinemas screened documentaries about the return movement, their ticket lines stretching down entire blocks. Storytelling archives were founded to preserve oral histories. Poets published works in ancestral scripts once dismissed as irrelevant. A grandmother in Bobo Dioulasso began night classes teaching proverbs to returnee children, telling them, they know the alphabet, now they must learn the root. What had begun as a moment of return was becoming a redefinition of citizenship itself. Citizens no longer looked to the state as a distant authority, but as a partner. Expectations rose. Politicians stopped promising change and began funding the projects people had already started. Parliament debated and passed a bill requiring that every development initiative include memory keepers, elders, midwives, artisans, alongside engineers and economists. When the vote passed with a standing ovation, it was not seen as symbolic. It was structural. The short-term impact was visible. Reopened schools, revived clinics, bustling markets. The medium-term transformation was harder to measure but undeniable. A population regaining confidence that its destiny did not need to be outsourced. In this climate, even skeptics softened. Families who once celebrated visas now toasted land deeds. WhatsApp groups once used for embassy tips now coordinated literacy circles, seed banks, and cleanup campaigns. Yet the shift carried deeper political consequences. Africa politics had long been analyzed through dependency. What aid flowed in, what contracts were signed. Now analysts were confronted with a different question. What happens when a nation chooses to depend on itself? And so, the call went out not just to Burkina Faso, but across the continent. Other nations watched, debated, hesitated, and prepared. The wave was no longer contained within one border. If you believe this is what Africa has needed all along, let your voice be heard in the comments. But as neighbors began to stir and the diaspora across oceans whispered of return, the question loomed. Was this the rebirth of a single country or the spark of an entire continent's awakening? While the streets of Ouagadougou filled with bonfires and song, far away in Washington and Brussels, the tone was starkly different. Policy rooms buzzed with urgency, not celebration. For decades, Western economies had quietly benefited from Africa's brain drain. African doctors staffed emergency wards in Philadelphia. Engineers powered oil projects in Alberta. Professors filled universities in Paris. Now thousands were boarding flights home, and suddenly the West faced an uncomfortable reality. What if the flow reversed? In Brussels, a closed-door briefing labeled the return wave a destabilizing anomaly. European officials debated whether to tighten visa rules for African students or to attach non-return clauses to elite scholarships. In Berlin, migration institutes issued reports describing the phenomenon as a threat index to European labor markets. In Paris, television panels argued bitterly over whether Africa had the right to reclaim its own talent. Washington's reaction was sharper still. A leaked State Department cable warned that if the trend continued, U.S. hospitals could face shortages in at least 5 cities. Another memo predicted a decline in research output if African professors began refusing tenure tracks. Analysts at think tanks coined new terms: reverse drain, talent reabsorption, geopolitical migration risk. Beneath the jargon lay fear, the loss of leverage long maintained through dependence. Yet while Western capitals fretted, other powers saw opportunity. Moscow deepened dialogue with Ouagadougou, presenting itself as a partner free from colonial baggage. Discussions of medical supply deals and energy cooperation drew headlines across Geopolitics Africa circles. Commentators began to link the new leadership with a broader trend of anti-colonialism Africa, where nations sought partners not as patrons, but as equals. The image of Ibrahim Traore Russia meetings spread across regional media, fueling debates over alignment and sovereignty. Regional bodies, too, could not ignore the tremor. ECOWAS, long criticized for following foreign scripts, found itself under pressure to either support or contain the movement. The African Union issued cautious statements recognizing diaspora engagement, while quietly commissioning reports on the long-term economic impact. In Ghana, Benin, and Kenya, whispers turned into pilot programs inviting their own diaspora to return. The contagion of hope had crossed borders. For the West, the challenge was not merely economic, it was narrative. For generations, Africa's story had been told through deficit, aid received, skills lost, dependence prolonged. Yet in Burkina Faso, the story was being rewritten as one of agency and sovereignty. No donor logos, no dependency contracts, just Africans choosing to build. This unnerved policymakers more than any statistic. As one diplomat in Geneva muttered privately, "If this spreads, we lose the leverage we've held for 50 years. The people of Burkina Faso did not hear those words. They were too busy pouring concrete, coding systems, and teaching children under mango trees. But the shadow of those concerns hung over every conversation in foreign ministries. Because the question was no longer whether one nation could rise. It was whether Africa itself was preparing to shift the balance of global power. And if that balance tilts, who will stand with the return, and who will try to stop it? The movement that began in silence had already redrawn the map of possibility. But even as clinics reopened and schools thrived, the horizon remained uncertain. Could conviction alone sustain what foreign aid had failed to deliver? Could the fervor of return withstand the pressures of scarcity, bureaucracy, and external interference? These were not questions asked in the streets of Burkina Faso, where hammers rang and chalk dust rose, but in the quiet reflections of elders who had seen movements bloom and fade before. One path forward lay in resilience. If the momentum continued, returnees could anchor long-term systems, community health cooperatives, locally driven education, independent digital infrastructure that would outlast any single leader. A generation raised abroad now held the tools to rebuild without permission. This was the opportunity to transform brain drain into brain gain, dependency into sovereignty. Yet risks were real. Western governments had already begun tightening visas and scholarships, wary of losing skilled labor. Foreign investors whispered warnings about budgetary strain. Aid agencies shifted tactics, offering deals wrapped in conditionality. If unchecked, these pressures could fracture the unity of the return, leaving some tempted by incentives abroad, while others struggled against the weight of rebuilding. Here the leadership of Ibrahim Traore mattered. His calm defiance, "You had them for 30 years. Let us have them for one generation," captured both determination and fragility. The movement was not his alone, but his tone set the stage. The risk was not authoritarianism, but fatigue. Could he hold the balance between popular energy and global pressure, between grassroots spontaneity and the machinery of state? Across Africa, the choice loomed larger. Ghana's pilot trauma centers, Benin's mobile seed banks, Kenya's digital reforms, all drew inspiration from Burkina Faso's example. If replicated, the return could become continental, redefining Africa politics as a story not of aid, but of action. If fractured, it could be dismissed as a momentary surge, a footnote in the annals of Geopolitics Africa. For the elders watching, the lesson was both sobering and hopeful. They remembered the promises of independence, the charisma of leaders like Thomas Sankara, and the betrayals that followed. But in the sight of grandchildren painting murals, coding hospital systems, and planting ancestral seeds, they also saw something different, an awakening not of ideology, but of practice, not rhetoric, but roots. The road ahead was therefore not a single line, but a fork, dependence or dignity, compromise or conviction. And though the world still debated statistics, the people on the ground had already chosen. They were building. Still, one question lingered like a drumbeat beneath the songs of return. If sovereignty has been reclaimed, can it endure the storms that are certain to come? What began with a whisper has now become a drumbeat across the continent. The return of thousands was never just about jobs or buildings. It was about memory, about reclaiming a dignity that had been scattered for generations. In the villages of Burkina Faso, where children once dreamed only of visas, they now speak of bridges to be built, clinics to be opened, seeds to be planted. The narrative has shifted from dependency to determination, from absence to presence. For the elders, it feels like long-awaited vindication. They carried the burden of exile, of watching their brightest depart, of hearing foreign voices claim ownership over Africa's destiny. And now they see their grandchildren back in the soil, proving that the story was never about weakness. It was about waiting for the right moment to rise. For President Ibrahim Traore, the test is greater than any speech. His quiet defiance has reminded the world that sovereignty cannot be borrowed, it must be built. His name is spoken in markets and classrooms, not as a savior, but as a reminder that leadership can listen instead of dictate. And for the people, the movement has shown that power does not flow from capitals abroad, but from communities who choose to stand. This is not nostalgia. It is not temporary. It is the architecture of a new Africa. One where the best no longer leave, but lead. One where the legacy of Thomas Sankara finds its continuation not in monuments but in living systems of justice, education, and health. One where Ibrahim Traore is not an exception but a symbol of a generation unafraid to say, "We will build without permission." If this story moves something in your chest, do not let it pass in silence. Like, share, and subscribe. Our history was muted for too long. Now it is our turn to say our future out loud. And as you do, leave your voice below. Write Africa Rise or New Africa, or simply It's Time for Africa. Because the story is no longer theirs alone. It is ours. It is yours. The return is not the end. It is the beginning.